everybody, and happy Harloween. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another spooky Harloween video. And today we are picking up with the story of the Bloody Benders, a group of 4 people, often referred to as a family, who caused death and chaos on the Kansas frontier. The Benders set up a seemingly innocuous homestead in Labette County in the 1870s, but behind their rustic facade lay a chilling secret, a house of horrors that became a grim and gruesome stage for unspeakable atrocities. As weary travelers passed through the vast and unforgiving wilderness, the Benders lured them into their web, offering food, shelter, and a fleeting and false sense of security. Little did their victims know that they were entering a nightmarish realm where life held no value and death was the only escape. And the macabre truth began to unravel as whispers of disappearance spread across the Kansas frontier. Lawmen and vigilantes embarked on a pursuit to find the truth about these unsolved disappearances, and they would uncover a tableau of terror that defied reason. A hidden cellar beneath the floor of the Bender cabin and a well-kept vineyard behind it concealed the remains of those who had dared to seek refuge with the murderous family. And the bodies of the dead would bear the telltale wounds that would become the Benders' calling card. Today we are diving back into this story, so if you haven't seen part 1 yet, you should go and watch that, because 1 always comes before 2. And before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Incogni. Today, we can feel safe in knowing that the Bloody Benders, although they were never found, are no longer a threat, and their murderous deeds have stayed in the 1800s. But there are still modern threats we have to worry about. Privacy is very important to all of us. I know it's important to me because a lot of my life is out there on the internet, but I want to make sure that there isn't too much of myself out there because I want to protect myself and my family. Every day, thousands of companies are collecting, aggregating, and trading your personal data without you knowing anything about it. And I'm not just talking about the basics like your full name or email address, phone numbers, even your physical address. I'm talking stuff that can really mess with your life, like employment history, IP information, social security numbers, credit card numbers. And it's really scary to think about what someone could do with all of that information. And if these companies are only selling your data, that's the least of what could happen. I don't want to give anyone that kind of access to me or that kind of power to mess with my life. And don't even get me started on what happens if any of those companies have a data breach. For instance, PayPal is just one of the companies to report massive data breaches. And when these things happen, you don't even find out about it until the company notifies you. And by then, all your information, including credit card numbers, banking info, social security numbers, are up for sale on the dark web. And then, it's out of your hands. You have the right to request that data brokers delete what information they have on you and protect your privacy. The bad news is, it's really hard to do yourself. It would take you years to do it manually alone, and that is where Incogni comes in. Think of them as your personal assistant / best / bodyguard. Incogni can do all of that long, messy work for you automatically. Incogni helps you protect your privacy and take your personal data off the market by reaching out to data brokers on your behalf and requesting that your personal data be removed, and they deal with any objections. I've definitely had issues in the past with identity theft. Multiple lines of credit were opened under my name. It took years to fix everything. It's been an actual nightmare, and I don't even wish that on my worst enemy. I never want to go through that again, which is why I use Incogni myself. Incogni is even great for smaller issues, like when I'm Googling something for a case, and then I see all of these weird ads pop up for things that I'm not really interested in, and actually things that kind of are a little probably dark because of the things that I research. I don't really want that happening, so Incogni helps with that. And the Incogni setup process is super easy. And as somebody who's very tech challenged, I can say that if I'm able to do it easily in just a couple of minutes, anybody can. You just sign up with your email address, and then a number is going to pop up on your screen showing you how many data brokers Incogni has on its list who are ready to be contacted, which I love because this is a real tangible number and it makes me feel like something's already being done. It makes me feel like somebody is on the case and I'm one step closer to being safe on the internet. I love that Incogni is easy to use and streamlined and there isn't a bunch of clutter on their interface. It tells me only what I need to know so that I can move on with my day. And then as time goes on, Incogni will keep you updated on what's happening. For instance, for me, after a few weeks, I was notified that 9 data brokers had already deleted my data, and I was able to clearly see this illustrated in the Incogni dashboard. So I definitely think you should try Incogni out for yourself. Everyone can benefit from the service. I mean, anybody who uses the internet, right? Which, if you're watching this, you are. So right now, the first 100 people to click the link in the description box below and to use code stephanieharlowe will get 60% off at Incogni. So start getting your private information wiped from the internet now by clicking the link below or going to incogni.com/stephanieharlowe and use code stephanieharlowe for 60% off at Incogni. Thank you so much to Incogni for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. So when we left off last time, we were talking about Dr. William York of Onion Creek and how his disappearance would create a growing movement that would eventually connect the Benders to a string of similar disappearances of travelers on the Osage Trail. We will return to that, but first, let's go to Labette County in 1873, when the surrounding community was growing tired of the Benders and their antics. Kate Bender's sometimes unfriendly and annoyed demeanor was growing in frequency, and there were emerging reports that she'd been harassing sick people, trying to bully them into paying for her psychic healing powers, and promising to curse them if they refused. Word was growing around the surrounding settlements that the fiery-haired, hot-tempered Kate Bender was a witch, but she still had the support of her closest neighbors and friends. That is, until they too became the targets of her manipulating and threatening tactics, specifically the Denst family, who lived on the homestead that was nearest to the Bender cabin. On March 8, 1872, 26-year-old John Denst was killed in a fire, leaving his young wife a widow and their 2 small daughters fatherless. After John's death, his wife Delilah found comfort in Kate Bender and her seemingly endless knowledge of the spirit world. For a year, Kate tried to convince Delilah to join her in a seance so that they could communicate with the spirit of her dead husband, but Delilah was nervous about messing with such things. Delilah didn't come from a spiritualist family. She came from a very traditional, homestead, religious family, and anything that kind of messed with talking to the dead or the supernatural just really wasn't looked upon warmly in her household. But this did not stop Kate from bringing it up every time they saw each other. And when March of 1873 rolled around, Kate's repeated requests for a seance reached a new intensity. She told Delilah that the anniversary of her husband John's death would be the perfect time to actually do this seance. He would be close by. The veil between the mortal and the spirit realm would be thinner, and they could easily reach John. Still, Delilah was not convinced, and Kate continually demanding that they needed to do the seance. This had given her kind of a bad vibe. So Delilah again said no. There would be no seance. Thank you very much. But that's a no from me, dog. Delilah claims that when she gave this response, Kate Bender's facial expression darkened and her tone became sharp. A week later, Kate was riding past the Denst homestead when she stopped in for a visit, and she once again began pushing Delilah about the seance, at which point Delilah's mother-in-law, Henrietta, stepped in. Henrietta told Kate very clearly that their family didn't believe in contacting the dead through a medium, and they had no need for Kate's fraudulent services. And then Henrietta told Kate to leave and never come back. Henrietta said that a look of outrage and contempt spread over Kate's face before she galloped off on her horse, and the Denst family hoped they'd seen the last of her, because from that point on, relations between these two families and neighbors became very tense, and they really didn't have anything to do with each other. In April of 1873, Alexander York and his younger brother Edward put together a group of 65 men that included a private investigator named Thomas Beers from Independence. A week after Dr. William York's disappearance had been discovered, the group set off down the Osage Trail, stopping first in Osage, Mission, where they found out William had spoken to several people there. Next, they headed to Ladore, a railroad town between Neosho and Labette County. Now, Ladore had gotten a bad reputation in recent years due to the rising crime rates and violent outbreaks, which had culminated in a terrible act committed by 7 men in May of 1870. The 7 men, who were described as outlaws and who had been hiding out in Indian Territory, had already been drinking heavily when they stumbled into the saloon of James Roach in Ladore at 9 p.m., demanding more alcohol and rooms for the night. So I'm going to talk later about this Indian Territory and why it was such a desirable place for people who were on the run or hiding from the law to basically, hang out in. But the people, the outlaws, the criminals, things like that, they wouldn't necessarily stay in this area. They would go into the surrounding towns for, alcohol, food, female companionship, things like that. And then they'd go back into their hiding spots if they felt like the law was hot on their trail or if somebody recognized them or something like that. So they go to James Roach's saloon, which is also an inn, and they want alcohol, but they're already very, very intoxicated. So James Roach told them to leave. And when he did this, he was beaten unconscious with the butts of their guns. And then the men proceeded to ransack the whole place, which led them to discover Matilda and Jane Talbot hiding in a closet. These 2 young girls worked as housekeepers at the saloon, and after they were pulled from their hiding place, the 7 men sexually assaulted them. Now, at some point, the drunken men began arguing amongst themselves, fighting over these 2 girls, and this led to a violent attack, which left one of the men dead. The 6 men who remained left the saloon with Jane Talbot, and in the chaos and the fray, one of them managed to get away alone with her, stealing away to the woods, where he wrapped them both in a blanket and fell asleep. Ladore's Vigilante Committee, a group of residents who had made it their mission to battle the growing crime issue in town, well, they got their guns, they got their clubs, and they went out into the night to find the remaining culprits. Susanna Abel's husband, Jim, was a part of the Vigilante Committee, and Susanna and Jim ran a boarding house near James Roach's saloon. Soon after her husband left, Susanna heard the sound of someone trying to break into her house. It was 2 of the outlaw men who were looking for more alcohol and probably more women. So Susanna rushed herself and her 2 teenage daughters into their attic, but the violent and drunk men spotted her just as she was getting up there safely, and they tried to follow because the ladder to the attic was still down. Susanna hadn't gotten up there completely yet, and she hadn't pulled the ladder up yet. So they start climbing the ladder, one right after the other. And when one man's head popped into the attic, Susanna smacked him with her husband's hatchet, sending him flying backwards, where he knocked into his buddy behind him. While the man who had been hatcheted lay on the floor unconscious, the other man went back to the ladder and climbed it because I guess he was too dumb or too drunk to understand that he would face the same fate. As he peeked into the attic, he also took Susanna's hatchet to the face and fell to the ground, out cold. And can we just please have a round of applause for Susanna Abel and all the other badass, tough frontier women like her who were not afraid to protect themselves and their families, just like the men of the frontier. Susanna must have been so terrified in that moment, knowing what had happened to the other 2 girls at James Roach's saloon, knowing that she had 2 teenage daughters and herself to protect, and knowing that the Vigilante Committee was out, probably roaming the plains, not anywhere close by, no help was coming. And so she did what she had to. And she was very brave to do that and very badass. So her husband, Jim Abel, and the Vigilante Committee would later come back and find the 2 men unconscious, and these 2 men were taken into custody. They were also able to locate the man who had taken Jane Talbot into the woods, and he was hanged from a tree right on the spot. By noon the following day, 3 other men were captured, and the 5 men who remained alive were all hanged from the same tree as their friend. So because of this incident and others, Ladore, being a railroad town, being someplace that was close to Indian Territory, and being a place where outlaws and criminals were known to hang out and, blow off steam, it really got a bad reputation, and the Yorks thought that maybe somebody there had gotten to their brother William. So when Alexander and Edward York, along with their search party, rode into Ladore, they got rooms at James Roach's saloon. But after looking around and talking to some people, the brothers felt that there was nothing in Ladore to help them find William, and they rode on to Parsons. And that wasn't necessarily true. It took a few days for them to figure out there was nothing going on. I very much condensed this whole part of the story because we just don't have enough time to make 12 parts about this case. But what ended up happening was the younger brother, Edward, heard word around town that James Roach was luring people into his saloon and like drugging them and robbing them. So he started suspecting James Roach. Edward and James got into a big fight, and then the brothers rode off and they went to Parsons. And then James Roach was really pissed and he wrote not an email. Oh, my 2023 brain. He wrote a letter to the governor, which probably took 4 weeks to reach the governor by Pony Express. And James Roach was like, listen, everything that's going on with these missing travelers on the Osage Trail is affecting Ladore very badly, which is affecting my business very badly. So people are afraid to come here, not only because of the general lawlessness of this area, which, hey, we could use some help with that too if you want to send like the military or something, but also in general, there's rumors that these missing travelers are ending up in Ladore and never being seen again. And then the governor wrote back and he was pretty much like, sorry, dude, we don't really care about this. The military has other things to worry about. There's Native Americans running wild and attacking us. And, we really have to deal with that right now. So you guys are on your own. Is it any wonder that most of these towns had vigilante committees? And I know that it may be, kind of controversial to take the law into your own hands, but when you don't have an established body of law enforcement in your area and, people are just running wild doing whatever they want, you got to do something, right? And so I kind of understand it. I understand it. So in Parsons, the York brothers were told by a clerk at the general store that their brother, William York, had been there the previous week. He had purchased some tobacco from the store. So Thomas Beers was the private investigator that the Yorks had hired to help them find William. And while the York brothers were talking to the clerk at the convenience store, Beers strolled around town asking about William, and he was approached by a teenage boy who claimed that he'd encountered William York. He said the doctor had stopped him and asked if he was riding the right way to get to Independence. When the teenager told him that he was, William continued on, riding in the direction of Big Hill Creek. Now, if you remember from part 1, this was the same area where the two brothers had found the body of William Jones the year before when they went fishing. And remember, Jones had had his head crushed in and also his throat slit. The Yorks' search party decided to go and look around that area for clues, and they wanted to enlist the help of Leroy Dick, who, once again, if you remember from part 1, was the township trustee of Cherryvale, which was just 2 miles from the Bender cabin, and Leroy Dick knew the Benders very well. Leroy was asked if there were any local troublemakers or shady characters in town, and he immediately thought about the Benders. The two older Benders, Ma and Pa, had never been overly social, but for the past several months, many people had also been complaining about the younger Benders, John and Kate. Leroy realized that he hadn't seen much of them recently, and John had stopped attending Sunday school, becoming very defensive when Leroy had questioned him about his absence. And the reason that Leroy had even asked John about why he wasn't in Sunday school anymore was because he had previously been very impressed by John. John was able to quote huge chunks of scripture from memory. He seemed to have a very, very good understanding of the Bible. And so Leroy Dick was like, well, we don't know if he's sleeping with his sister or not. We don't really know what this dude does for a living. He disappears for months at a time. We don't know where he's going. He does have this tendency and this weird and unsettling habit to just give a high-pitched giggle 25 million times during any given conversation. However, kid knows his Bible, so there must be hope for him yet. When John stopped going to Sunday school and when he became more withdrawn, Leroy asked him, "What's going on, son? Why aren't you in Sunday school anymore? God misses you." And John basically was like, "Stay in your lane, old man. Mind your business." And that was a very, defensive and kind of sharp reaction that Leroy hadn't been expecting. So Leroy also told the Yorks' search party about the robbery of Edward Earns's new bride and her mother a few years back, and how the Bender family had been suspected. He also said that Kate Bender claimed to be a medium with healing powers. Leroy Dick said that he would help them search the area of the creek for any signs or clues of Dr. William York, but he said he absolutely did not want to be present if and when they went to talk to the Benders because he did not feel comfortable with them knowing that he'd given their names to the York brothers. And Leroy Dick is often going to be like, well, I was never afraid of them, but, I always knew they were kind of like suspicious and there was just something off about them. But not wanting the Benders to know that you were the one who pointed this search party in their direction, that kind of, to me, says Leroy Dick maybe sensed something instinctually, in his like prehistoric lizard brain. These people are dangerous and I don't want to be an enemy to them. I don't want to be on their bad side. On April 4th, 1873, Colonel Alexander York, P.I. Thomas Beers, and another man in their search party named Jim Buster, they rode to the Benders' cabin, and they pulled up, or galloped up, to find young John Gebhardt outside, reading the Bible. So apparently he's still a big fan of the Bible. He just doesn't want to go to the book club and talk about it. John did not acknowledge them as they passed by him to walk inside, but once they got inside, they were greeted by a smiling Kate who glowed with pride when Alexander York told her that he was there to inquire about her services that he'd seen advertised in the paper. Alexander told Kate that his brother was missing, and he would like her help finding out whether William was alive or dead. And Thomas Beers remembered that when Kate heard William's name, her face became tense for a moment, but she quickly recovered, changing her expression into one of concern. Kate said, well, that's a big ask, I don't just perform on command. You can't just plug me into the wall and I start, dancing around for you. This is something that's going to take time. I can't just start asking the spirits questions. A request like this is going to take, a few weeks. And of course, some money. So Alexander York and the other two men started kind of like muttering amongst themselves like, oh, she's a hack. She's, just a fraud. There's no such thing as talking to the dead. We should have known she couldn't help us. And as they turned to leave the cabin, Kate put her hand on Alexander York's arm, and she looked up at him through her lowered eyelashes, speaking softly and telling Alexander that if he came back the next week alone, she would have the answers to his question. The men left the cabin that day feeling unsettled by the Benders and their home, which smelled strongly of decay. But Alexander claimed it was another dead end, and they'd only felt off about it because they were in the presence of a woman who exploited people out of their hard-earned money with the promises of contacting their dead loved ones. The search party moved on to Independence, and at that time they didn't know that as they left the Bender homestead, the four Benders also began making preparations to leave, and they would never return to Labette County again, as far as we know at least. 4 days later, on April 8th, a meeting was held at the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse in Cherryvale, and Leroy Dick addressed the gathering townspeople about these mysterious disappearances, telling them that 8 men and 1 little girl had vanished on the Osage Trail in the past 6 months, and 2 men had turned up dead. Leroy announced that there would be a search of all cabins along the Osage Trail, and those who lived on that route nodded in cooperation and agreement. They had nothing to hide. But noticeably missing amongst them was the Bender family. The York's private detective, Thomas Beers, received word on April 9th that a wagon had been discovered abandoned outside of Thayer. A double-barreled shotgun was found in the back, and underneath that was a wooden sign that had the word groceries etched into it roughly. But the word was spelled incorrectly. It was spelled Grocrys, Grocrys. On the back of this sign, the word groceries was spelled out correctly. It was neatly printed. It was, the sign that you'd probably want. It was kind of the sign that you would make once you made the Go Cry signs and then hung it up and somebody came in and made you feel really stupid about it. And then you were like, well, how would you spell it? And then they're like, give me that board. And then they wrote it correctly. And then you put it back up, So it didn't really make any sense. But overall, this little grocery sign on this wooden board was significant because the Benders had displayed a sign just like it, identical, outside of their cabin, which advertised the selection of convenience items they had for sale. But they didn't put the side that said groceries spelled correctly out to the public. They put the Go Cries side out. The Go Cries side. Why? I don't understand it. I know the whole story's a mystery. I know that. This little Grow Cries sign is maybe the most mysterious to me of all, because I just don't understand why you would put the incorrectly spelled word out to the front when you knew the correctly spelled word was on the back. But the most important thing that was discovered on this wagon was that both of the back wheels were damaged. They were dished or twisted the wrong way, the same as the wagon tracks found in the mud just feet away from where the body of William Jones had been found floating in Big Hill Creek, his head caved in and his throat savagely sliced. Meanwhile, in Labette County, the search had started for the missing Osage Trail travelers. But in early May, bad weather and torrential rain had slowed down the search parties, even forcing them to retreat inside for days at a time as travel along the trail became impossible because the mud thickened to the consistency of wet cement. After days and days of rain, one dry day brought Labette County resident Billy Toll out of his cabin, which was on the land adjacent to the Bender's cabin. Billy was trying to get some work done outside while the weather held out, and he was actually looking for a few of his cattle who had taken off during the night in fear from these intense lightning storms that were happening. As Billy Toll set out to round up his herd, he passed the Bender place, and he saw a cow, but not one of his. Outside the Bender cabin, Billy Toll found a calf laying in the mud, alive but barely alive due to a lack of food and water. Running into the stable to get some water for the calf, Billy encountered more malnourished cows in swarms of big black shiny flies that were just waiting for the animals to finally collapse. It was clear that no one had cared for these cows in days, maybe even weeks, but Billy was afraid to approach the Bender's front door and knock. He certainly was too afraid to enter. He noticed that the cabin was dark and still. There were no signs of activity inside, and there was a stale and rotten smell lingering in the air coming from inside of the cabin, as well as from the general direction of the Bender's small orchard behind their cabin. Rubbing the back of his neck in anxiety, Billy Toll took one last look at the scene that lay on the ominous Bender land, and then rode into town to let everyone know that it seemed the odd foursome had left town. On May 5th, Leroy Dick, the closest thing to the law in the isolated cluster of homestead communities along the Osage Trail, he rode out to the Bender property to look into Billy Toll's claims for himself. When he dismounted from his horse, the first thing Leroy noticed was the smell of death, which seemed to be clinging to the moisture in the spring air. Leroy Dick, like many other men at that time, was a Civil War veteran, and he knew this smell, like he knew the scent of his favorite pie baking in the oven. As he approached the cabin, Leroy also spotted what appeared to be several piles of manure mixed with fresh soil heaped outside of the barn, and this indicated to him that the Benders must have been digging deep into the earth somewhere on their property because the soil seemed fresh and there was so much of it that it couldn't have been just kind of like a couple shovelfuls here and there. The door was unlocked, so Leroy let himself in, and he was once again greeted by the smell of stale decay that he'd grown accustomed to in the Bender cabin, but now he noticed the smell was stronger, and it became more pungent the closer he got to the back of the cabin, towards the family's living area. Slipping past the canvas divider, Leroy began to look around, and he noticed that underneath a straw mattress was a trap door in the floor. When he moved the mattress and exposed the trap door fully, the foul odor increased in intensity, becoming almost unbearable as Leroy lifted the trapdoor to reveal a dark and dank cellar. Sure that he was about to encounter a mass of corpses, Leroy bravely ventured down into the cavernous depths of the cellar, but he found himself standing in an empty, dirt-walled hole on top of a slab of sandstone that had been laid on the ground to act as a floor. Relieved that he had not dropped down into a mass grave, Leroy Dick climbed out of the cellar and began looking around the dusty, fly-infested Bender cabin. Next to the straw mattress that had concealed the trapdoor to the cellar lay a faded Bible, its spine cracked from age and wear, and inside the front cover were the words, John Bender, Born July 1848, 22nd of January 1873, Hal went off. 3rd of February, Ella went away. 6th of October, our Henry was born in Havre. He died on the 4th of December 1860. 19th of January is a slaw day. Now, these words had been written in German, but many people interpreted the word slaw to be short for slaughter. Near the Bible was a tattered Catholic prayer book with more German words written inside of it, but I could not find the translation of these words anywhere, even in newspaper articles from that day. Underneath the wood-burning stove, Leroy Dick uncovered 3 hammers, a 3-inch claw hammer, a long hammer with an elongated head, and a handmade sledgehammer, which weighed about 5.5 pounds. Alone in the Bender cabin, enveloped in the smell of decaying flesh, Leroy Dick shivered and walked briskly to his horse. The Bender cabin and land would have to be searched thoroughly for the bodies of these missing travelers, and God knew what else they would find. But a search would have to be conducted the following day, and it would take a lot of men with a lot of shovels. The next day, May 6th, the floor of the stables was dug up, but they found nothing. They next began to excavate the cellar hidden beneath the trapdoor in the cabin, and in order to have full access, the entire cabin had to be moved from its original location so that the hole in the ground was exposed and easier to enter. The horrible smell in the cellar was strong, just right off the bat. But when the sandstone slab was removed, and the way they did this, by the way, was by tying a rope around the slab and then tying the other end of the rope to a bunch of donkeys and then making the donkeys pull it out, those poor donkeys. But when that slab was moved, the smell rushed at the men digging like an invisible sucker punch, causing many to begin gagging and crawling out of the ground to vomit. Now, no human remains were found in the dirt, but the soil was very wet, and they noticed that it was clumped together in an unnatural way. Dr. Keebles, the town physician, was present, and he inspected the dirt, telling the gathered men that the damp substance soaking the ground was most likely human blood, and it would have taken quite a bit of blood to completely saturate the earth in this kind of way and to cause this clumping effect. As the morning passed and the sun rose higher in the sky, the men continued working in the cellar, taking shifts when they felt queasy and when they needed to tap out. As they dug, Edward York rode up, accompanied by the private investigator Thomas Beers. Word had reached Independence of the Benders' escape, and Edward had heard that Leroy Dick had put together a group to search and excavate the property for bodies. Beers headed over to the cellar where everyone else was, but Edward began to wander through the Bender cabin, which now sat several hundred feet away from its original location. He saw something stuffed underneath the grocery counter. It was a horse bridle, and as Edward turned it over in his hand, he recognized the bridle as belonging to his missing brother, Dr. William York. As he walked outside, heading towards the search party to show them what he had found, Edward's eyes wandered to the small orchard that had once been partially hidden by the cabin. But now the cabin was moved, so there was basically just like the hole in the ground that the cellar was in, that all the guys were searching in, and then behind that you could see the whole orchard now. So, forgetting about the bridle for a moment, Edward whistled to the men who were still digging in the cellar and told them to follow him. They were going to the orchard, and they should bring their shovels. Since the York family was very into gardening and growing things, remember in part 1 I said they had the most well-known gardens in the area, Edward York and his brothers had grown up planting things. They'd grown up in fields, in vineyards, and gardens and orchards. And because of this, Edward and his brothers were very familiar with planting and gardening. They were very familiar with what the earth looked like at any given moment. And Edward's eyes had immediately been drawn to what looked like cracks in the soil, and this suggested the earth had recently been turned over. Edward York pointed to the first pile of blistered earth that they walked up to and told the men with their shovels to start digging there. As soon as the first few scoops of soil were lifted from the ground, the smell of human decomposition rose up to greet them, and within a few minutes, the first of the Benders' victims to be uncovered was exposed, and it was William York. William's head had been smashed in, just like the other bodies that had been recovered in the months past from the area, and his throat had been sliced open. He'd been buried wearing nothing but an undershirt, and a bandage was wrapped around his left knee from an injury he had sustained months prior. Examining the body, Dr. Keebles concluded that the blunt force trauma to William's head had been made using 2 different weapons, and this triggered Leroy Dick, who stood nearby gazing at the body in horror, to remember the 3 hammers he'd recovered from the Bender cabin the previous day. He went to his saddlebag and removed them, presenting them to Dr. Keebles, who verified that 2 of them were in fact the weapons used on William York. That day and the next, several more bodies were pulled from the earth of the Bender's orchard. The next man to be found was Henry Mackenzie, or Hank, the cousin of Leroy Dick, who hadn't even known that Hank had been missing. Mackenzie was also buried in nothing but an undershirt. His head had also been smashed in with a hammer or 2, and his throat was deeply sliced. But Hank, brave and battle-hardened Civil War veteran and teller of colorful war stories, he had fought back. There were several defensive wounds on his arms and hands, and a later examination of the Bender cabin would reveal multiple bullet holes in the walls and in the ceiling. Leroy Dick believed that his cousin wouldn't go down easily, and the bullets had been shot from his gun as he'd fought for his life. So in death, Leroy Dick was finally able to give Hank the credit that he deserved, and I guess he didn't find him as obnoxious anymore. Next, the body of William McCrotty was found, whose forearm had been tattooed with his name and date of birth, as well as the regiment he'd served in during the war. McCrotty had gotten this tattoo in case he died during battle, and he had to be identified amongst a sea of bodies. He most likely never thought that he would fall victim to a murdering band of psychopaths, and that his tattoo would come in handy after all, long after the Civil War ended. McCrotty was buried face down wearing a white undershirt and a checkered overshirt, along with a black cloth vest and white socks, and he had died the same way, a blow to the head and a violent throat slash. Next, the body of Benjamin Brown was revealed. He was naked except for a red and white handkerchief tied around his neck and a silver ring on the pinky finger of his right hand. He had died the same as the others, and Dr. Keebles believed he'd been buried in the orchard for at least 6 months. Later, Leroy Dick would hear a rumor that Brown's horse had been seen in Arkansas a little after his disappearance, which had happened at the end of November. Now, these were very nice horses, and people noticed them. It's kind of like today when someone's driving a fancy, expensive sports car, and those around take notice and remember. They're going to remember, a Lamborghini more than they're going to remember a Honda Civic. And so the possibility that Benjamin Brown's horses had been seen in Arkansas after Brown had disappeared, and knowing that Brown was now dead in the Bender's orchard, this led to the seeds of a theory that the Bender family were not just murderers, but thieves, and that they were working with others. And this theory would end up being incredibly accurate. The Benders would lure travelers to their cabin. They would murder them, rob them, and then pass the stolen goods off to their accomplices to sell out of town. Now, George Longcore was found buried with his throat slit so deeply that his head lolled at an unnatural angle. His 18-month-old daughter, Marianne, was found buried with him at his feet, half covered by his legs. She was still wearing her little dress and mittens, and because there were no marks on her body, Dr. Keebles concluded that Marianne had been buried alive with the body of her murdered father. It was believed that Longcore was the perfect target for the Benders. Not only was he traveling to another state to live, meaning no one would miss him at home, but he was carrying all that he owned in the world with him. Valuable things, family keepsakes, money. Another man was dug up, but his body would not be claimed until almost a year later, at which point he was identified as James Farrick. He had died the same way, blunt force trauma to the head, sliced to the throat. Another body would later be identified as Johnny Boyle, and he was found wedged 6 feet into an old well on the property. He was horribly mutilated. The muscles of his body were rigid and contracted as if he'd been burned alive. The papers at the time said that Boyle's body was so disfigured in the area of his head, and it was clear he'd been one of the first men killed due to basically how decomposed he was, to the point where they couldn't even figure out if his throat had been slashed, because he was basically just a skeleton with some clothes on at that point. Now, there were 8 bodies found on the Bender homestead, and these victims, along with William Jones, John Phipps, and the unidentified body at the campsite, brought that number to 11. The Benders, it appeared, had claimed at least 11 lives, and no one had any doubt that there were more victims out there somewhere. For weeks after this, masses of people traveled from all over to the Bender homestead to look around and, slip a thing or two in their pockets to keep as morbid souvenirs. A special 7-car passenger train even began making runs to the Bender homestead to make it easier for people to look around and loot. And this train basically advertised specifically and specially that they were like the Bender cabin tour transportation. And a local paper printed, quote, "Last Sunday, it was estimated there were 3,000 people on the grounds at one time," end quote. On June 25th, 1873, the paper updated everyone on the gruesome roadside attraction, saying, quote, "The whole of the house, excepting the heavy framing timbers on the Bender's farm, and even the few trees have been carried away by relic hunters." End quote. Based on what was found at the homestead, it was decided that the Benders would bring people into their home. They would have them sit at the table with their backs to the canvas sheet separating the front of the cabin from the back, and then someone, or multiple someones, would creep out from behind the curtain and then bash their guests over the head with a hammer. The victim would then be placed at the opening to the cellar, their throats would be sliced, and they would be tossed down into the damp darkness to bleed out. And why the cellar was used as a holding place for the bodies would be for multiple reasons. One, if the victims were murdered at night, the Benders couldn't very well be traipsing out to the orchard with bodies slung over their shoulders in broad daylight, and it would take quite a while to dig a hole, get somebody buried. So, you'd probably want to make sure you had the whole night to do that. And if you're doing a murder and burying a body over the course of one night, maybe, that's just putting too much on the agenda. You got to break it up. Additionally, it had been a long and bitter cold winter, one of the coldest on record at that time. And for many months, the ground had been frozen solid, so any people murdered during the cold season would have to wait until spring to be buried when the ground thawed. So when Alexander York showed up to the Bender cabin and talked to Kate about finding his brother and figuring out whether William was alive or dead, it's very likely that there were, one or more bodies still in the cellar at that time, and the Bender family had to hastily bury these bodies before taking off in the dead of night. It also made sense why the Benders had been so unwelcoming to John Handley and his friend when they stopped at the cabin that cold winter night. The Longcors would have been guests of the Benders just 2 days before. And since it was one of the coldest winters in years, George Longcor would have been dead in the cellar, and Mary Ann Longcor, who was presumably still alive, would have been in the cabin somewhere, possibly out of sight of any visitors. But if she began to cry or make a fuss, someone might ask questions like, "Hey, where did this baby come from? Kate, did you and your brother finally have a baby together? What's going on here?" Now think about that for a moment. Think about how completely twisted and disgusting it is. Think about the type of people and their completely void moral character that they would take part in something like this. George Longcor would not have been buried until the spring thaw, months after his murder, and Mary Ann was buried alive with him, meaning these people, the Benders, kept this baby alive, this 18-month-old baby, and kept her with them for an extended period of time. And even though they had, had her with them, not dead, as a little baby, an innocent little baby, they still had no qualms about completely killing her when it was time to dispose of her father's body. And that's some of the most truly messed up stuff I've ever heard, honestly. Now that their bloody and dark deeds had been uncovered, it was time to find the bloody Benders, who had quite a healthy head start on the vigilante mob. Marshal Jim Snoddy from Fort Scott, along with P.I. Thomas Beers and another man named Charles Peckham, who'd been a colonel during the Civil War, they traveled to Thayer on directions from Alexander York. The Benders' abandoned wagon with the twisted back wheels had been found outside of this town, and a nearly starved dog had been found inside of the wagon, and this was the Benders' dog. Based on the distinctive groceries sign found on the floor of the carriage and the dog that everyone knew was the Benders, there was no doubt that this carriage had belonged to the Benders. So the first stop was the train station in Thayer. The man behind the ticket counter told Snoddy, Beers, and Peckham that 4 people matching the descriptions of Ma Bender, Pa Bender, Kate Bender, and John Gebhardt had boarded a train headed to Humboldt, Kansas about 3 weeks prior. The ticket agent grimaced as he explained that he remembered the foursome clearly for a couple of reasons. First of all, the luggage that the older couple carried was a trunk made out of dog hide, and I guess at that time it was very common to have traveling trunks, that had some sort of animal hide on them, but dog hide was something that not a few people would see. And the people who worked at these train stations that would report back to law enforcement about the Benders would always be disgusted when they talked about this dog hide trunk, saying that there was still like hair attached to it. Also, the ticket agent had seen the 4 Benders get on the train, but then as the train started pulling away, Pa Bender kicked the dog out of the train and basically just left him behind. And this poor dog made his way back to the carriage because that was the only place he knew to go to. He couldn't go all the way back home. And the dog stayed in the carriage, scrounging for food where he could, but basically completely malnourished for weeks until the carriage was found. Peckham and Beers traveled to Humboldt, and they were able to discover that it appeared the 4 Benders had split up in Kansas. John and Kate were seen boarding a train that was headed for Denison, Texas, 1 mile south of the Texas-Oklahoma border. But the self-proclaimed lawmen lost their scent there, as no one in Denison had seen a couple matching their description. The 2 elder Benders had been spotted once again because of their disgusting dog hide trunk, and they had boarded a train headed for St. Louis, Missouri, where they'd been transported to Lafayette Park. A carriage had dropped them off at a boarding house that was run by a woman who ended up being Pa Bender's sister. But when Peckham and Beers arrived, Ma and Pa were long gone. The sister told them that the Benders had been there a few weeks earlier. They'd arrived without a word, they were in bad moods the entire time that they were there, and then they vanished without a word. And it was right around the time that the paper started printing stories about missing travelers showing up dead in the ground of an unassuming Labette County homestead that the grumpy duo had suddenly departed. And Pa's sister said she had no idea where they were headed to. From newspaper accounts at the time that were tracking the search, it appears the Benders all boarded the 9:03 p.m. train from Thayer to Humboldt on April 4th, 1873, the same night that they'd been visited by Alexander York looking for his missing brother. What is most likely is that Ma and Pa, after they left St. Louis, reconvened with the younger Benders in Denison, Texas, a bustling settlement by the Red River, which was known, once again, I know this feels repetitive, and it feels like every town is being described this way, but Denison was known for its lawlessness and vice, and it was based on its location to what was called Indian Territory. This was a chunk of land that Native peoples were moved to after they were removed from their ancestral lands. In the 1870s, Indian Territory extended from the present Texas-Oklahoma border to the Nebraska-Dakota border, but the area was a perfect place for outlaws and criminals to hang out and hide out because it was not under the jurisdiction of the United States. It wasn't under any jurisdiction, which meant they could not be pursued or arrested by authority of any kind. LakeTexacoma.com says, quote, "The existence of such an immense frontier so near to the newly settled districts of Texas enables rogues of all grades to commit many crimes of impunity, for, once over the Red River border, a murderer or horse thief can hide in the hills or in some secluded valley until his pursuers are fatigued, and then can make his way out in another direction," end quote. We know the Benders were in Denison at some point because Albert Owens, the owner of a boarding house there, would later report that a tall German man who worked on the railroad and his red-haired wife had pitched a tent near his establishment. And he'd seen an older couple with them from time to time. He said that the morning after he first saw the older couple, the younger man paid him a visit and introduced himself as John Bender, explaining that his in-laws had traveled to meet he and his wife in Denison, and they were all planning to travel further west. Owens said he tried to warn John that if they went any further west, it could be dangerous. That was where the bad people, the outlaws, hid out, and it was a lawless, desperate wilderness, no place for a law-abiding family. But John gave his usual high-pitched laugh and told Owens that he knew all about the types of people who made their home in the borderlands of Texas and Indian Territory. On May 5th, when Labatt County was rocked by the discovery of body after body buried on the Bender homestead, the group of 4 fugitives were already leaving Denison, heading to Red River Station, which was 4 miles south, and this was where they would meet up with an old friend and known criminal who was also on the run named Frank McPherson. Red River Station was a tough frontier settlement filled with cowboys and outlaws. It was even more on the fringes of society than Denison, and Frank's older brother, William McPherson, kind of ran shit around there. William, or Missouri Bill as he was known, was 6'3", and he had a reputation for being a man capable of anything, including murder. The Benders had met the McPhersons in the spring of 1872 while John Gebhardt was in Clay County, Texas, visiting family. By the fall, both brothers were working with the Benders in their criminal enterprise of robbing travelers and then selling their stolen goods and horses. According to the book Hell's Half Acre by Susan Jonanes, quote, "With the aid of the McPhersons, the Benders were able to unload stolen goods at a faster rate with lower risk of being caught. John and Pa no longer had to travel hundreds of miles to sell identifiable horses that belonged to their victims. They simply handed them over to others involved with the McPherson gang and returned to the cabin to wait for the next potential target," end quote. So now I guess we know where John Gebhardt was going when he left Labatt County and, was somewhere for weeks or months at a time. He was selling the things that they'd stolen from their murdered guests. But when the McPhersons and others became involved in this nefarious plot, Gebhardt didn't have to leave as much. And maybe that's why Kate became grumpy, because I'm sure John was actually her lover, boyfriend, husband, partner, whatever. And maybe having him and his high-pitched giggle around more often than not put her on edge. I completely get that. And the timeline did make sense because it seemed that when the Benders and the McPhersons joined forces, the rate of the killings increased, and 7 of their victims were murdered, one right after the other between October of 1872 and March of 1873. So it's like a work smarter, not harder kind of situation, right? Once the Benders were safely at the home of Missouri Bill, he agreed to help them get further west and evade the men who were on their trail. At the end of May 1873, Thomas Beers and Charles Peckham heard through the grapevine that the Bender family had been seen with Frank and Bill McPherson in Red River Station, so they boarded a train and headed that way. Frank and the Benders were long gone by then, but Missouri Bill was still there, and initially he was helpful and cooperative, claiming he didn't know where the Bloody Benders were, but he would ask around and see if he could find out. Bill McPherson, Missouri Bill, would lead these 2 men on a wild goose chase for weeks, killing time and distracting them as their targets got further and further away. So he would be like, "Oh, I heard they're camping out in like this plateau or this plain. Let's go there." And it would take days to ride out there. And then Missouri Bill would be like, "All right, let's set up camp here. And I'm going to ride out and kind of scout the location. That way it's only just me and I'm not as obvious and they're not going to hear a bunch of people galloping towards them. I'll just like quietly, go and find out where they are, and then I'll come back and let you know." But then he would disappear for days, and then he'd come back and be like, "Oh, I had a lead. I was tracking him, but I lost him." And he would do this over and over again until one day, while they were camping somewhere, he just took off and he never came back. And then Beers and Peckham kind of figured out like, oh, this guy's fucking with us. Like he's not actually going to show us where the Benders are. And so after a while of this, Beers and Peckham were kind of done with the shame and embarrassment that this Missouri Bill dude had put them through, and they headed back to Kansas in defeat. However, private investigator Beers would later return to Red River Station, where he'd heard that Bill McPherson had gotten out of town basically right after Peckham and Beers had left. And the gossip around town pointed to the Chickasaw Nation, where it was believed the Benders were staying in an outlaw camp at Mud Creek. Now, this camp apparently housed 10 white people, including the Benders and the McPherson brothers, along with 4 Native Americans. And Beers realized at that point the murderers had been hiding in plain sight. They were known around these towns like Denison and Red River Station, and they were being protected by the people who lived there, who mostly were also like outlaws or afraid of the outlaws and getting involved in outlaw business. But basically, the Benders weren't even attempting to keep their location a secret, and their movements were well known in these areas. So he hired a local guy to bring him out to Mud Creek, but all Beers found were the remnants of a camp that looked as if it had been abandoned for about a week. It's believed that from their camp, the Benders had crossed the Red River into Clay County, Texas. By August, they were laying low at a cabin south of Henrietta with another criminal associate, Floyd Slimp. Allegedly, at the time, according to reports, both Ma Bender and Kate were dressing in men's clothing, and Kate seemed to really enjoy this, as well as the publicity she was receiving for her part in the murders of the Osage Trail travelers. She bragged to Floyd Slimp about being famous now. She said, "There's a lot of people who are looking for me, and they're talking about me in the papers," because at that time, the papers were talking about Kate a lot more than the other three Benders. She was the most kind of elusive one, like the medium, the spiritualist, fiery red hair, tigerish grace, and the local media had painted Kate as like the driving force, the mastermind, the seductress, the temptress, the siren that brought sailors to their deaths on the rocks of the shore. So Kate Bender was very much enthralled by this. It reminded me a lot of Bonnie Parker, of Bonnie and Clyde, that she loved this recognition and it didn't matter what it was for. She just loved that people were talking about her. And Kate told Floyd Slimp he needed to call her Jenny Gardner from now on because she had to lay low because she was a very well-wanted fugitive at that point. Now, reports state that the next morning, the McPherson brothers left, but the Benders stayed another 3 days, and they used this time to go scouting for a safe place along the Little Wichita River, where they could camp before moving on. While at Floyd Slimp's cabin, they met a man named Sam Merrick, who was an outlaw and a horse thief, but he didn't have the stomach for the kind of violence that the Benders had become known for. Even though Merrick knew what the Benders were being accused of, and even though he wasn't a specifically violent person himself, he did seem to be very attractive to Kate Bender, who confided in him, and he would later tell police that the Benders had never talked in detail about their crimes. And they had also never shown remorse for them, even though he and everyone else knew what they'd done. When Merrick returned to Floyd Slimp's cabin the following month, the Benders weren't there, but he did run into Frank McPherson, who told him that the Benders had headed north across the Red River and up Beaver Creek, headed west to Wanderers Creek, where they would be camping out in Prairie Dog Corners with a band of outlaws. How cool are these names? Prairie Dog Corners, Wanderers Creek? Come on. It's like basically these places were named to sound like cool places that outlaws would hang out. Sam Merrick would see the Bender family again in the winter of 1874 around Christmas time at another rugged outlaw camp on the Cap Rock Escarpment, which is a narrow slice of land, a geographic demarcation line in Texas that runs 200 miles south-southwest from the corner of the Texas Panhandle near the Oklahoma border. And because of the geological features of this escarpment, it was a very safe place to camp compared to other options because the people camping there would be protected from the vicious winds that ripped mercilessly through the flat plains that surrounded the escarpment. And this was a place that, once again, many outlaws were known to hide out in when they didn't want to be seen around town because they knew that law enforcement was on their tracks. Merrick claims that at this point when he saw the family, Kate Bender was in bad shape. She was still dressed in men's clothing, but she'd become unable to keep up with her basic hygiene in the rough and dusty outlaw camp. When Merrick saw her, Kate was covered in dirt. Her vibrant red hair was matted and hung limply around her shoulders, and she complained to Merrick about living like a prairie dog with no bed, no pretty dresses, and no money. In 1875, Sam Merrick would be arrested for stealing 10 horses from a Native American man, and years later, while he was attempting to be released from jail, Merrick told the authorities that he thought he knew where the Benders were, and if they worked with him, he hoped they could come to an arrangement that might make everyone happy. Merrick claimed the Benders had either gone further south on the Staked Plains, which is an area of about 30,000 square miles along the high plains of the Texas-New Mexico border, or they'd gone up into the Guadalupe Mountains located in West Texas and southeastern New Mexico. Merrick said that the family could have even returned to the Cap Rock Escarpment, and he warned the authorities that wherever the Benders were hiding out, the territory would be hard and unforgiving. And if men were sent to go find them, these men should be armed and ready for ambushes. The Benders were each known to carry a Sharps 50 caliber rifle, which apparently was capable of taking down a buffalo, and they knew how to use these weapons. They weren't just proficient with hammers and knives, also with firearms. And Merrick said the only way to grab the Benders without a fight that was sure to end in a lot of bloodshed and death was to drug them, and he offered to infiltrate whatever outlaw camp the family was staying with at that time so that he could slip something into their morning coffee and knock them out. And that way law enforcement could just come in and take the Benders into custody, and nobody had to, get shot at, nobody had to die, and everyone would be happy. And most people were all for it. They were excited to potentially have a man on the inside. But when the governor of Kansas was asked to greenlight Merrick's plan, he claimed that an operation of that magnitude was too risky and difficult to coordinate. But most importantly, it was too expensive to coordinate. In 1883, Thomas Gates, the owner of a silver mine in Arizona, wrote to the governor of Kansas and said that he knew the Benders were in Gila County, which was also in Arizona. A few months later, reports got back to Kansas that the Benders were ranching at a secret location in Colorado, and we know from records that Frank McPherson was living in Gunnison, Colorado at that time, at the base of the Rocky Mountains. It's believed that if the Benders were still alive and sticking together in 1883, they would have been with Frank in Colorado, and in 1907, Frank McPherson was still in Colorado, but in Los Animas by then. Los Animas was a place that John Gebhardt was familiar with since he and Frank had spent a lot of time there selling horses that they'd stolen. Both of these reports had viable information behind them. These were legitimate eyewitness sightings, yet nobody from Kansas was sent to check into them. However, a whole big deal was made about a certain trial that ended up being a huge waste of time. In 1889, 2 women were arrested and accused of being Ma and Kate Bender. Elmira Monroe and Sarah Davis were traveling together when they were arrested in Niles, Michigan on a larceny charge. After they were found not guilty of that charge, they were released, but they had not been free for 1 day before they were arrested again for the murders the Bloody Benders had committed. And this is a bizarre story, okay, because I'm going to try to get a little bit more specific without saying too much, but these 2 women were mother and daughter. Elmira was the mother, and then Sarah was the daughter. And this bizarre story came to be because the women were identified as being the Benders by Frances McCann, who claimed to be the daughters of one of the Benders' victims. So Frances was allegedly also a clairvoyant healer with psychic abilities, and she told a colorful story about a young woman she'd met while living in Kansas. Frances said this woman was Sarah Davis, a single mother of 3 who Frances had hired to help her around the house. Sarah was a hard worker but very secretive about her past, and one night Frances had a dream during which she saw the murder of a man unfold at the hands of 2 women who she knew from her psychic powers were mother and daughter. When Frances told Sarah about her dream, she claims that Sarah became immediately agitated, stood up, started pacing, put her hands to her head, and told Frances, "You cannot talk about this with anyone. What you saw in your dream can never leave this house because the man you saw murdered was John Sanford, your father, Frances, and he was killed by my family, the Benders." Not only that, but Sarah claimed that this had happened when she was a child, and she'd been present for it. Now, Frances McCann quickly bought into this because she'd been orphaned by the age of 3, and she'd spent her whole life trying to track down family members and figure out, where she'd come from. So this revelation was very interesting and compelling to her. Frances claimed that by using her spirit guides, she was able to figure out that Sarah was Kate Bender, and the other woman she'd seen in her dream was Ma Bender. Shortly after this, Sarah left Kansas and ran to Michigan, but Frances pursued her and followed her wherever she went, which is when she found her living with an older woman named Elmira Monroe, who was Sarah's mother. Frances immediately wrote to Labette County, letting them know she'd found 2 of their murderers. Spoiler alert, these 2 women were not Ma and Kate Bender, but the bizarre thing is, they said they were. Something happened between Sarah and Elmira. I don't know. They got in a fight. They had bad blood. Something happened. But Sarah went to the police and claimed that her mother, Elmira, was Ma Bender, which then caused an angry Elmira to file larceny charges against Sarah, stating that Sarah had stolen a frying pan, some plates, and a pair of baby stockings. Both women ended up running from the law, but they were arrested outside of Niles, Michigan, where they stayed until Sarah's larceny trial. Now, like I said, these larceny charges would eventually be dismissed. Sarah was like, I don't know what this woman's talking about. She gave me this pan and these stockings and these plates as a wedding gift, so I did not steal them, and that was able to be proven. But while they were both in jail waiting for the larceny trial, that's when Leroy Dick of Cherryvale, Kansas, heard about Frances McCann's wild story. And then when he saw pictures of the two women who were in jail in Michigan, he said, oh, these are the Benders. And this older woman, this is Ma Bender without a doubt. So he traveled to Niles, Michigan. He talked to Sarah and Elmira while they were still behind bars. And this was when Elmira informed him that Sarah was Kate Bender. So we've got Sarah claiming that Elmira is Ma Bender, and we've got Elmira claiming that Sarah is Kate Bender. And what I see is them in a jail cell together for days and days and days, like on opposite ends of the jail cell, just like this, looking at each other, like, from across the jail cell. And they start just like hurling accusations at each other. And Elmira's like, Sarah, who the hell is this Ma Bender person that you told the police I was? And Sarah told her the story about the Benders that she'd been reading in the paper, because that's, right around the time that this would have been very popular in the media. And Elmira was like, okay, thank you for this information. Now I'm going to tell everyone that you're Kate Bender, and it seems like she's the one that everything's being blamed on. So may the odds be ever in your favor. Basically, they each claimed that they themselves had done nothing wrong. The other person was the evil one, but they were both very keen to tell Leroy basically whatever he wanted to hear, hoping that it would get them released from jail. During Sarah's larceny trial, Elmira repeated her accusations about Sarah being Kate Bender, which caused Sarah to then put on a huge show, crying and, throwing a fit in the courtroom. And Sarah told a very, very heartbreaking, tragic story. Sarah claimed that her mother had kept her living in fear since she'd been a child, and she had once witnessed her mother beating another child to death, making a then 10-year-old Sarah assist her in disposing of this child's body. Sarah claimed that her mother, Elmira, had told her that if she said a word about it, the same thing would happen to her. So, of course, Sarah says, listen, I was born into this violent family. They were murderers. I was just a little kid, and I was taught that murder and violence were normal, but I never killed anybody, but they made me help them. They always made me help them, and I was afraid for my life because if I said something or I tried to stop them or if I tried to leave, they would find me and kill me too. So the papers, who seemed to now find Kate Bender, aka Sarah, a sympathetic figure, began printing stories about the terrible Elmira Monroe, a.k.a. Ma Bender, and all the people that she'd brought to their end, stating that this woman had been married 7 times and some of her husbands had mysteriously vanished, so now we have to look into that, investigate her husband's disappearance. She probably killed her husbands. Are they buried on the Bender property? Where are they? It was a whole bunch of just a media circus that nobody could get enough of. And driving this narrative was, of course, Leroy Dick, who could never be convinced that Elmira and Sarah were not the Benders, even though Elmira did not speak a word of German. She didn't even have a German accent, and Sarah didn't look anything like Kate Bender at all. Her hair wasn't even red, it was brown. So when the 2 women were put on trial in Labette County for murder, one of the Benders' closest neighbors, Silas Toll, was brought to the courtroom to identify them. And he said nothing about the defendants resembling Ma and Kate Bender. In fact, he looked at them and he was like, I don't know who these people are, but this ain't Ma and Kate. It ain't. It's not them. Eventually, lawyers for Sarah and Elmira provided documentation to the court that proved they could not have been responsible for any murders in Labette County, considering they'd been nowhere near Kansas at the time that the murders happened. It turned out that Frances McCann had paid the women $50 each to hurl accusations at each other. The women then sort of got carried away with it, kind of feeling like the only way they could save themselves was by throwing the other person under the bus, and also Leroy Dick injecting himself into into the situation, made them feel like they had somebody of authority who could protect them as long as they said what he wanted them to say. And apparently it wasn't nefarious on Leroy Dick's part. He had bought the whole crazy story lock, stock, and barrel, and he actually believed that these two women were Ma and Kate Bender, and apparently he believed this, like, until the day he died. He was like, we let them go. We had them, and we let them go. Even though this woman, Elmira, didn't speak any German, didn't have a German accent. Like, we can convince ourselves of a lot if we really want to believe it, I guess. That's the moral of the story. So who were the Bloody Benders, and what became of them? None of the four were ever caught, even though authorities in Labette County would receive tips about their location for years to come. Author Susan Jonasis believes that Ma and Kate Bender were most certainly biological mother and daughter. She also believes that Pa was one of Ma's husbands, not necessarily Kate's biological father, and Kate and John were probably common law man and wife. She feels that they lied about being a family because it was easier, and it would raise less questions in the traditional frontier homestead community. But neither Ma and Pa or Kate and John were legally married. They were just, common law, like they lived together and they called each other man and wife. Also, it is very likely that Bender was not their real last name. It's believed that Kate was born in America, but raised by German-speaking parents, and both Pa Bender and John Gebhardt had immigrated from Germany. And even though the newspapers at the time blamed Kate Bender for being the mastermind behind the Osage Trail murders, Susan Jonasis believes that it was actually John Gebhardt and Pa Bender who were the driving force behind the murders. Specifically, John, who at first would come off as quiet and unassuming, but in the end it seemed he was little more than a glib con artist who used charm to win people over. But neither he nor Kate could wear that mask for very long, and that's why they started to show their true colors as time in Labette County for them wore on. The better question is, why were these people never caught? There were investigations and large rewards offered for their capture. Tons of information came in that pointed to where the Benders were at any given time, yet nothing ever happened. Now, the reports of the day claimed that law enforcement didn't know where the Benders were, but that appears to not have been true at all. From what I can tell, it seems that law enforcement knew where the Benders were for about 18 months, and there's correspondence that shows the government just didn't want to continue putting money into tracking the murderers, who were always on the move and usually hiding out in lawless areas where any law-abiding citizen would not feel comfortable entering. They basically just said these people are too good at hiding and they know where to hide, and it's not worth it for us. It's just not worth it. It also seems the authorities in the little railroad towns that the Benders would visit to stock up on supplies maybe were a little bit corrupt, and the family somehow seemed to always get warning when law enforcement from Kansas was in the area, attempting to apprehend them. A Pinkerton detective had even offered his services to track the Benders into the Wichita Mountains, where it was said they were, and even though he was well-trained and part of the most effective private detective agency in the land, he never returned home after heading off into the mountains. A bounty hunter who was hungry for the reward money followed the Benders to Red River Station, and he also vanished without a trace. The fate of the Bloody Benders remains unknown, but no one is under the impression that they stopped their terror of campaign, especially after escaping Labette County with no repercussions. There's a very interesting theory that the four stayed together and settled in another area, going by a different name but performing the same evil deeds. 4 people with the surname Kelly arrived in White Oak, Kansas from Pennsylvania in the 1880s. They were Father William Kelly, Mother Kate Kelly, and 2 younger individuals, Bill and Kit, who were allegedly William and Kate's son and daughter. The Kelly family operated a small tavern out of their ranch, which was located on a main road and convenient for weary travelers to stop for a meal or a night's rest. In early December of 1887, the Kellys suddenly left home and never returned, and it was a week before anyone noticed. When the ranch was looked into in regards to a missing man, the first thing that was noticed was the foul odor that permeated the air inside the home. 3 badly decomposed bodies were found in the cellar, 4 more bodies were found buried under the stable, and 4 more were buried alongside the barn. And listen to the way that the Kelly family was described in early reports. Quote, "A very ingeniously arranged trap door was found on the floor of the house, through which it was supposed the victims were dropped and killed. Either the father or in some cases the daughter, who was not a bad-looking girl, carried on conversations with guests while the mother prepared the meal. Everything was being readied for the sacrifice of the victim, who was seated at the table, his chair being placed on the trap. At the given signal, the spring was touched, and the unhappy traveler would be thrown down into the basement where, in the dark, if the fall did not break his neck, he could be dispatched at pleasure." End quote. The Kellys are also believed to have killed 11 travelers, including 2 women, so that they could rob them and sell their possessions. And when they had enough money, they left their home and they took a similar route that the Benders had taken to evade capture, heading through Texas and towards New Mexico, hiding out in some of the same places that the Bender family had hidden out in. Now, the details of the crimes and the getaways do seem very similar, and since we have no idea what happened to the Benders, I won't say it's impossible. It is absolutely possible. That would be crazy, though. That would be crazy. The story of the Bloody Benders, scarier than fiction, has stuck with many people. Journalist Max McCoy, who grew up in Cherryvale, said, quote, "The Bloody Benders has all the elements that would fascinate a young kid growing up in Kansas," end quote. And like many others, McCoy had grown up touring the Cherryvale Museum, opened in 1961, which featured an exact replica of the Bender cabin inside of it. The actual cabin had been torn apart board by board at the hands of angry community members and people who wanted a little piece of Bender history for their very own. But the museum in Cherryvale built a very convincing replica, and the cabin held wax figures of the 4 Benders, along with the 3 hammers that Leroy Dick had recovered from the Bender cabin, and the cabin showcased a wreath made out of the actual human hair of the Bender's victims, which I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know. That's very morbid. I don't know. It's a little weird. And in general, Cherryvale has had a complicated history with the Benders, and for decades they celebrated something called Bender's Days, which was an annual festival, I guess, in honor of the murderous family. I don't know, or just because, I don't know, the town was affiliated with the Benders. I wouldn't say it was in honor of them, but it was controversial, to say the least, and Cherryvale no longer does Bender's Days, and the replica cabin has been dismantled. But just like journalist Max McCoy, a Wells Fargo analyst from Independence, Kansas, named Bob Miller also toured the museum as a child. He was very, interested in the cabin, and he became engrossed with the story of the Bloody Benders. For 65 years, the Bender land had been owned by a family of farmers who didn't have any interest in its history. Therefore, a search of the property was never done, and any graves of potential additional victims were never looked for. But when the land came up for auction in 2021, Bob Miller bid on it. Bob said, quote, "I bought it because I love history, and I would like to find out where the killings happened. Somewhere, somehow, some way, I'm going to get some kind of expert investigation going there," end quote. So there's so much land that the Benders owned, so many acres. The actual location of where the Bender cabin stood and where their orchard grew hasn't really been known. And Miller said he would bring in professional archaeologists to conduct a ground-penetrating radar study and possibly do some excavations. Miller said, quote, "If we could find some stuff, some bones or maybe teeth, that would allow for DNA matching with living relatives," end quote. And in July of 2023, a team of researchers from Kansas University began working on the property with that exact goal, identifying areas of interest for excavation. The team has reported that they've already found broken bits of pottery and old square nails, leading them to be confident that they've narrowed down the exact location of the cabin and outbuildings. So hopefully Bob Miller and this team of archaeologists will find out something. Maybe they can find other people that the Benders killed, and maybe the family members or the descendants of these people can be notified, and so that these people can be added to the list of victims and that they can be remembered and they can have, some sort of, recognition or closure for what they went through at the hands of this murderous family. And as somebody who's very interested in history, this is compelling to me, and I'm going to be keeping up on it. While further victims of the Benders may be discovered, the truth about where Ma, Pa, Kate, and John ended up and what their fates were will most likely forever remain hidden in mystery. A dark and twisted story to be whispered about around a campfire blazing on the Kansas prairie. And that is all I have for you today. I really want to know what you think about the Bloody Benders, what you think about the story. What was the most interesting part to you? What is the part that you're most curious about? And just in general, did you like it? So don't forget to like this video if you liked it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, subscribe if you haven't already. But before we go, don't forget we have Stephanie's Small Business Showcase. Today's small business comes to us from Clara, who's an analog photographer based in Paris. She says she mainly does street photography, but recently she's been branching out and doing product and food photography still on film because she feels that the look analog film provides is truly unique and stands apart from what we're used to seeing across social and websites, which I completely agree. I think it looks amazing because I looked at her stuff and it's really good. Her street photography and her product photography. She said, while my food photography services might be slightly geographically limited because they require me to come to the restaurant, when it comes to product photography, I've been able to collaborate with brands outside of France. They just ship me the product and I photograph it at home. Should these services not be useful to many of your subscribers, I also sell my photography prints on Redbubble, and I have a small YouTube channel in English all about film photography, which could perhaps interest your subscribers who also have an interest in photography. So this is awesome. She gave me all the links. She gave me the link to her YouTube channel, to her prints of her photography on Redbubble, as well as her street and product photography. So I'm going to link all four underneath, but these are really beautiful. As a business person, I love the look of her product photography. It's clean, it's really framed well, the way that somebody who understands photography would frame it, and I just think it's beautiful. As far as her street photography, I mean, come on. This seems to be where she absolutely excels. She takes pictures of people just out and about on the street, doing their thing. And she's really captured the humanity and the relatability in these people. She's really captured just the beauty of the day-to-day, the beauty of life, and I'm really into it. So I'm going to link everything for Clara below. Give Clara a shout out, subscribe to her YouTube channel, visit her on Instagram. If you're in France or the Paris area and you want a restaurant or a food company and you want to use Clara for your products, or if you own any kind of business outside of France, like she said, you can send her your products and she can photograph them for you and provide you with beautiful pictures in return. So go check her out. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'll be back with you soon for another Harloween video. But until then, stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay spooky. I'll see you very soon. Bye.
Getting you slowly, so you got to let it go. I got blood on the strings, blood on the strings.